On July 20th, 1969, over 500 million people were glued to television sets all around the world as astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to land on the moon. This completed the challenge set forth by President John F. Kennedy just 8 years before of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Many consider this to be the most significant achievement in the history of mankind. But how did we get there? In the 1950s and 60s, amid spectacular achievements by the Soviet Union, President Kennedy asked what project would be so bold as to impress the whole world. Hi, guys. Jim here from the Intrepid Museum. Thank you so much for tuning into a very special edition of Intrepid Adventures. Today, we're going to be talking about the Apollo 11 landing on its 52nd anniversary. And once again, another free live program, Intrepid Adventures. If you feel like you may want to keep this programming flowing, please be sure to click the link in the chat. And your support will be very much appreciated. Jonathan is also once again working behind the scenes with me today. Before we begin, though, I would very much like to just kind of mention as a side note the very important launch of Blue Origin's New Shepard spacecraft this morning. A very, very important step. And if you think that you know why that spacecraft was named New Shepard, just put it down there in the chat and let us know, right? A very special shout out to Wally Funk, who became the oldest astronaut in space, the oldest person in space at age 82, and to Oliver Damon, who became the youngest astronaut this morning as well at the same time at age 18. But today, let's go 52 years back in history. And we're going to talk about the Apollo program. The Apollo program would build off of the successes of both the Mercury and Gemini programs. And the goals for the Apollo program went far beyond just landing Americans on the moon. They included to establish other technologies to meet national interests in space, to achieve preeminence in space for the United States, to carry out a program of scientific exploration of the moon, and to develop the human capacity to work in the lunar environment. The Apollo Command Service Module, which consisted of the crew capsule, that's the blue piece on top, and the command service modules would carry the lunar module, deliver it for lunar landing when in lunar orbit, and retrieve it later for the return trip to Earth. The crew capsule would be the reentry vehicle, carrying the 3 astronauts towards splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean, as was the case with Apollos 7 and 9, or the Pacific Ocean, which was the case with all other Apollo missions. It's worth noting that none of Apollo's components were reusable. The Saturn V rocket would be used to deliver Apollo's bigger and heavier equipment, as well as its 3-man crews out of Earth's orbit and onto the moon and back. Apollo's flights 1 through 10 were all about testing the systems designed to go to and land on the moon, as well as testing and training the astronaut crews in procedures and the use of specialized equipment. It was also about the crews gaining the skills and physical endurance necessary for such a bold venture as a moon landing. Now, specific objectives included the first crewed testing of the Apollo components, that was Apollo 7. The first visit to the moon to scout for future landing sites, that was Apollo 8. The first crewed testing of the lunar module, that was Apollo 9. And a semi-complete rehearsal of the lunar landing coming within just 9 miles of the lunar surface, that was Apollo 10. With all of these objectives completely 100% successful, it was now on to the surface of the moon. Now, original Mercury 7 astronaut Donald Deke Slayton, and he's the guy shaking hands on the left back there with kind of the cool striped 60s jacket there. He was director of flight crew operations from November of 1963 to March of 1972 and was responsible for selecting astronaut crews. He set up a crew rotation that naturally brought up Neil Armstrong as primary commander for Apollo 11. Now, Deke absolutely believed that every astronaut should be able to do every job that an astronaut does. So that simple rotation, simply by chance, brought up Neil Armstrong. It was his turn. Armstrong readily accepted Michael Collins as his command module pilot, and he selected Buzz Aldrin, after a night of thinking about it, as his lunar module pilot. Right? So we had our crew. All three men were seasoned aviators from the U.S. Navy or U.S. Air Force, and all had flown with distinction in the Gemini program. But who would be the first to step out onto the moon? Well, we do know the answer to that one. Neil Armstrong was chosen by Slayton to be the first on the moon because he was a civilian, having previously resigned his naval commission, and it was more in line with NASA's non-military aspect of the Apollo missions. He could also be a true representative of Earth and not just the United States this way. Slayton also appreciated that Armstrong was an ultra professional man who took himself and his missions very seriously. He felt with Armstrong, you could guarantee his first words would be something fitting. More about that later. Now, guys, the challenges these three men had to face were monumental. Although most of those technical challenges had already been successfully achieved with the Gemini missions, there remained some big obstacles to overcome, not the least of which was prolonged exposure to cosmic and solar radiation, operating in a zero gravity environment, and while on the moon in 1/6 of Earth normal gravity. And this is not even to mention the lack of privacy for these three guys for 6+ days. Now, guys, you may be familiar with this. This is, of course, the Apollo 11 crew patch. Beginning with the Gemini 5 mission, it became the responsibility of the crews themselves to design their own patches. And the Apollo 11 crew set out to create something that would not only symbolize the mission, but would also represent the intentions of America, the hopes of NASA, and the hopes of the crew themselves. They decided to keep their names off of the patch, like you see so many of crew patches with their names on it, because it wouldn't adequately represent the thousands of people who worked on the project. Now, Michael Collins was the original designer of this patch, and he originally had the number 11 that you see there. He originally had it spelled out in letters, but Neil Armstrong immediately declined it because the mission was designed to represent all people of Earth, most of which didn't read English. And the alternative Roman numeral XI for 11 was also declined for the same reason. Now, it was fellow astronaut Jim Lovell, who was the commander of Apollo 8. He suggested the bald eagle, the national bird of the United States. So Michael Collins flipped through a few National Geographic magazines, and he found a picture of an eagle that he liked, and he traced it out on tissue paper. He then sketched the moonscape that you see below the eagle at the bottom of the patch, but something still wasn't right. The crew still wasn't satisfied. The decision was made to put an olive branch in the eagle's beak to represent peace, but it still left the talons of the eagle outstretched, kind of menacing. After all, the picture that Michael Collins had chosen was a picture of an eagle swooping down in a river to grab a fish. So the decision was further made to take that olive branch and put it in the talons to close them off and soften the image. The Earth was added almost as an afterthought up in the upper left quadrant of the patch, like a blue marble in the sky. But folks, that Earth was incorrectly drawn. The Earth, as seen from the moon, would be dark on the lower half, not on the left side. This mistake was never corrected. Now, as the crew patch indicates, the lunar module was named Eagle, and the command module was named Columbia. The launch of the Saturn V carrying the Apollo 11 spacecraft and the first humans to walk the surface of the moon launched from the now historic Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 16, 1969. All goes according to plan. 44 minutes after launch, Apollo 11 enters into a trans-lunar orbit and begins its trip to the moon. The first ever color TV transmission made from space was made just minutes later. Now, maneuvers go so well on the way to the moon that only the second of 4 planned course corrections was actually needed. On July 19th, Apollo 11 achieved lunar orbit. And here, course corrections were needed to counteract something called lunar gravity perturbations. You see, the moon's gravity began pulling the spacecraft down towards its surface well before they were ready, so that had to be counteracted. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module for a final systems check. And 12 minutes later, it separates from the command module. And Michael Collins performs a visual check, simply looking out the window. He later writes that the Eagle is, quote, the weirdest looking contraption I have ever seen in the sky, but it will prove its worth. Upon successful separation from the command module, Armstrong remarked over the radio, quote, the Eagle has wings. After 13 orbits, the descent engines fire, and the Eagle starts towards the surface, taking the exact path taken by Apollo 10 just a few months earlier. Armstrong had to manually pilot some of the parts of the descent, including the final stages, to avoid landing on the side of a crater littered with boulders. And during the final seconds of the descent, the lunar lander's computers continuously sounded alarms, later determined to be the result of the computer trying to do too many things at one time. Aldrin would later remark that the computer was trying to solve problems they didn't want solved at that point. Now, the lead software designer and engineer for the Apollo 11 mission, Margaret Hamilton. It was without her innovative software design, which allowed the Eagle's computers to actually prioritize all of those tasks during the descent. If it wasn't for that design, the computer would have shut down and the mission would have been a complete failure. Margaret Hamilton is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, receiving it from President Obama in 2016. Margaret Hamilton also received the Intrepid Museum Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. The Eagle touched down on the Sea of Tranquility, which was landing site number 2, at 4:18 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and about a minute and a half earlier than expected. I want you guys to think about that. It is 1969. We're using some of the very first generation digital computers here in this venture. We're going to send 3 human beings 238,500 miles away from the Earth to the moon, and we're going to come within 4 miles away of the predicted landing site and a minute and a half of the predicting landing at. Now, because of the changes that Armstrong made, the lander had only 30 seconds of fuel remaining in its primary tank at the time of the landing. But more is made of that than is really necessary, because the lander still had a full backup tank left, so it had plenty of fuel left. Mission Control radioed, "We copy you down, Eagle." Armstrong responded, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Mission Control erupted in celebration. A controller telling the crew, quote, "You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." Armstrong later commented that the landing was indeed his biggest concern, saying that the unknowns were rampant and there were just 1,000 things to worry about. Now we're on the moon. It is time to make that historic first step. Now, NASA was adamant about not putting words in the flight crew's mouths, so it was left up to Armstrong to come up with something. And according to Neil Armstrong, he didn't even think much about it until he was actually on the surface. And what he came up with, he always felt was not very good. So take a look at this quote here. Let me zoom in on it for you. We should be familiar with that by now. For years afterwards, there was controversy. Did he or did he not say the word A in that sentence. He swore that he did, and in fact, he went to his grave swearing that he did say it, but it was nowhere audible on any of the original recordings. It wasn't until the 1980s, when the technology existed to further break down that recording bit by bit, section by section, that indeed they did find and hear the word A. So Neil Armstrong was vindicated. Okay, so it was a correct quote. On July 20th, 1969, at 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, humanity stepped on another world. President Nixon was watching the landing from the White House with his chief of staff, Robert Haldeman, and astronaut Frank Borman. After the successful landing, Nixon simply clapped his hands and said, quote, "Hooray." Nixon went on to speak to Armstrong and Aldrin from the moon's surface, saying, quote, "As you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to the Earth." After Armstrong made his historic first step, he had a number of things to do, tasks to perform. Aldrin joined him on the surface about 20 minutes later with his own to-do list. Aldrin described what he saw as, quote, "magnificent desolation." It's hard to argue with him there. Together, they would spend a total of 21 hours, 36 minutes on the surface. Only about 2.5 of that hours of that time was spent doing EVAs, actually walking on the surface of the moon. The majority of the time, the 2.5 hours, was spent collecting rock samples and lunar soil, which Armstrong described as being more like a fine powder. They also took a great deal of pictures, many of which we're now. Armstrong's iconic image of Buzz Aldrin, which made a multitude of magazine covers and newspaper covers as well, including National Geographic. This picture remains the defining image of Apollo 11 still to this day. The experiments that they conducted on the surface included passive seismic experiments to measure lunar quakes, lunar field geography, solar wind measurement, and the placing of this device here. This is a ranging retro reflector that is still being used today. And what this is used for is we can shoot a laser from the Earth. It will reflect off of that, and it will tell us precise distances. And it's because of this device put on by the Apollo 11 crew and subsequent devices put on by other Apollo missions that we now know that the moon is moving away from us at about 3 centimeters per year. All right, so all you young folks out there, don't worry, there's going to be plenty of moon around for you to see throughout the remainder of all our lives. One of the first things that Armstrong did was to set up a video camera to record everything that they did on a tripod. It was about 30 feet away from the lunar module, including one of the very first things they did was to plant the American flag. Now, other things that they would leave on the surface besides the flag and besides these scientific experiments included the Apollo 1 mission patch honoring the fallen crew. These 3 astronauts, of course, you remember from your history, died in a freak fire. They would leave medallions honoring 2 Soviet cosmonauts that died in accidents, including Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space, and Herman Titov, the second human to orbit the planet. Also, a memorial bag containing a gold replica of an olive branch to symbolize peace was left behind. And this, a small silicon disc containing goodwill messages from US presidents and leaders of 73 countries around the world. I want to draw your attention to the President Kennedy silver 50-cent piece there. Remember, it is his challenge that began this whole thing, this whole quest going to the moon in the first place. So very appropriate. Okay, the crew is now ready to ride the ascent stage of the lunar orbit, the descent stage of the lunar lander into orbit. The descent stage, kind of the bottom half of what you're seeing there, would remain on the surface and remains to this day on the moon. Attached to one leg of the descent stage is this plaque reading, Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. It's signed, as you can see, by the 3 crew members and the President of the United States as well. Now, while preparing for the ascent from the moon's surface, Buzz Aldrin kind of looked at the floor of the lunar lander and noticed a little plastic piece that was laying there. He picked it up and realized it was actually a switch to a circuit breaker that he had bumped into accidentally and broke it right off. That circuit breaker switch was supposed to be used to arm those engines to the lunar lander so they can make their ascent from the lunar surface and join Michael Collins in orbit. So to rectify this situation, Buzz Aldrin just took a felt pen. It's what they used to write in space. They still use it today in many cases to write, for example, on the ISS, International Space Station. And he simply jammed it in the hole there that was created by the switch, and that completed the circuit and was able to allow them to arm the engines for a successful ascent from the moon's surface. Now, while joining, after a successful docking with Michael Collins in the Columbia, Collins would later say that, quote, it was only then that he actually felt that they were going to carry this thing off. The Command Service Module entered a trans-Earth trajectory on July 21st, and again, only one single course correction was necessary for the trip home, during which 2 more color TV transmissions were made. On July 24th, after a flight of 195 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds, which was about 36 minutes longer than planned. You see, the original landing splashdown location was actually being covered by a thunderstorm at the time of Apollo 11's arrival. So they went to landing site number 2, which was about 9 miles away. So it took them 36 minutes to get there. Apollo 11 successfully splashed down in that second landing location in the Pacific Ocean, only 13 miles away from the recovery vessel, which was the USS Hornet, Intrepid's sister ship. After the splashdown, the crew underwent a 21-day quarantine to protect against the very small possibility of lunar contagion. Now, this was discontinued after Apollo 14, when they learned that the moon was indeed sterile, and we didn't have to worry about any viruses or any bacteria from the moon following us home on those astronauts and causing a pandemic. And we do know about pandemics. On May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy challenged the nation to put a man on the moon and bring him home safely. That challenge had now been successfully met. The public's perception of Soviet leadership and technology had been overturned. Apollo 11's success was enormously significant, coming at a time when American society was in a state of crisis. The Apollo program had produced some unintended and unanticipated consequences. Apollo 11 had recaptured the public's interest in space travel that hadn't been seen since the early 60s during the days of the early Mercury flights. Upon greeting the crew, President Nixon enthusiastically proclaimed, quote, "This is the greatest week in the history of the world since creation," close quote. People all over the country were never more proud to be Americans. The public's adoration of the crew culminated on August 13th, 1969, when the astronauts were honored with a ticker tape parade down New York City's Canyon of Heroes and given the key to the city. Don't worry, the key doesn't actually open anything. It's just symbolic. The flight of Apollo 11 was met with great enthusiasm around the world. The front pages of newspapers everywhere was evidence of this. NASA estimated that because of the nearly worldwide television coverage, more than half of the population of the planet was aware of the day's events. The population of the planet in July of 1969 was only 3 billion people. Although the Soviets tried to jam the Voice of America radio broadcasts being launched into the Soviet Union, most Soviet citizens were actually able to at least learn a little bit about the day's events and were able to follow it to one degree or another. Now, the Soviets didn't keep it a secret from their citizens, but they didn't openly share it either. Perhaps above all, Apollo 11 was a triumph of management in meeting the enormously difficult systems engineering and technical requirements. An unprecedented amount of data and resources had to be organized. There was an expectation now that a golden age of space exploration would begin, with destinations like Mars being squarely in NASA's crosshairs. But in reality, Apollo's success left a divided legacy. Many American leaders thought of this as an abnormal and costly situation, one which was not to be repeated. However, exploration of the solar system remains a priority for NASA. The Apollo program continued with 6 more missions to the moon, placing 10 more astronauts upon its surface. Highlights included the first use of the lunar rover, that was Apollo 15, and the official ending of the Apollo program and the official ending of the space race with the Soviet Union with the historic Apollo-Soyuz docking in Earth orbit in 1975. At the time of Apollo 11, NASA's tentative schedule included Apollos 12 through 20, the last mission concluding in December of 1972. During this time, public interest in the moon was waning, however, in favor of other events, mainly the Vietnam War and the protests and civil unrest that came along with it. Politically, this was an era of détente between the US and the Soviet Union. Relations weren't that bad. The US was no longer trailing the Soviet Union technologically, which had been the primary motivator for their manned space program in the first place. So congressional budget restrictions forced NASA to cancel 3 Apollo missions and repurpose the Saturn V rocket for the Skylab space station program. The Apollo program was followed by the highly successful Space Shuttle 30-year run. And when this program ended in 2011, the question of what's next was once again on the mind of the American government and its people. That question has recently been answered, and the answer has recently been delivered. We're going back to the moon. Although if you ask Buzz Aldrin, his choice would have been plainly the red planet of Mars. Right? We do have the Orion spacecraft being developed by NASA currently. This is what's going to take our next generation of astronauts back to several places, including the moon. Now, NASA has announced the Artemis program. Those of you who have studied Greek mythology or have it as a hobby, kind of like I do, will note that the Apollo program was named after one of the major gods in the Greek mythos, Apollo, the god of the sun, and many things as well. Apollo had a twin sister. His sister was Artemis, and Artemis was goddess of the hunt, of wild animals, of vegetation, and things like that, a nature goddess. This next program, Project Artemis, will have a decidedly female bent because during Artemis 3, the third mission, is planned to land on the moon. We're going back by 2024. And that crew of 4 astronauts will include the first woman, also the first person of color to visit the moon. They will all be there to keep the man on the moon company. Several private space companies are now and will continue to partner with the US government through NASA. By now, we're all aware of SpaceX, of Blue Origin, of Virgin Galactic, and the like. But Apollo 11 remains to this day the single most recognized mission in NASA's history. Let me take you all back to that day of July 20th, 1969. On that day, while walking around on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin were permitted to carry a small amount of personal belongings with them to the moon landing. I want to share with you a couple of things that Neil Armstrong brought along with him. Armstrong included a small sliver of wood and a small piece of fabric. That small piece of wood was from one of the propellers, and that piece of fabric was from one of the wings of the Wright Flyer, which made its historic first manned, controlled, powered, and sustained flight on December 17th, 1903. They made 4 flights on that day. Their longest flight was exactly 852 feet long. You could have made that entire flight on the flight deck of the Intrepid, where I'm broadcasting from now. Only 66 years later, folks, within one generation, we're 240,000 miles away from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, walking on the moon with two pieces of that historic aircraft. And guys, on that day, just after 4:18 p.m., when the Apollo 11 had successfully landed on the moon, down in Arlington, Virginia, where the eternal flame burns, that's the gravesite of President John F. Kennedy. Remember, he started the whole thing with his challenge. An unknown visitor laid a bouquet of flowers on John F. Kennedy's grave with a little note attached. It said, "Mr. President, the eagle has landed." Right? There you can see something equivalent to it there. Folks, I thank you so much for joining us for today's very special presentation. Let me just quick go through the comments here and see if I do, since we have a little bit of time, see if I have any questions. Oh, okay. So prepaid Obsidian. Yeah, Jonathan, maybe you can put that up on the chat. Um, could the astronauts leave the moon's surface at any time in case of emergency, or are there specific windows of time that they had to wait to take off? Okay. Interesting question. Once they got that circuit breaker problem fixed, they when you hear or watch TV programs about launches today, they talk about windows of opportunity, okay, or launch windows. That means that when you launch, you try to rendezvous with something or meet something in orbit, or you're trying to hit a spot in orbit or things like that. To answer your question, I guess more precisely, they could have taken off earlier than they needed to if they wanted to. But because of the extra fuel that they had to use in the landing, remember it was a manual landing by Armstrong, chances are they might not have been able to rendezvous with Michael Collins in the command module if they needed to take off at any other time, if they missed, quote unquote, their window of opportunity. Right? So that would have presented just probably another problem for them. Good question. Good question. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? Vash, yeah, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad that Neil was also vindicated as well. I always thought he did. Guys, if there are no other questions, again, thank you so much. Please join us on Thursday for our next virtual Intrepid Adventures. Until then, folks, if I can borrow a line from a well-known astrophysicist, keep looking up.